Good day, everybody. Benji Kiel, welcome on behalf of the Muncie Delaware Nation to Solidarity Day, June the 21st, 2021. Ndishinzi Kike Mark Peters here at Nalahi, the Muncie Delaware Nation on the Thames River, or the Deshkanzibi in southwestern Ontario, Canada. And I've been asked to say a few words, comments in regards to Solidarity Day this year, June 21st, and thought I'd make a few comments which might last 10, 20 minutes at the most, but I've ended up with 7 pages of notes, so we might be going a little longer than that, and it's because I want to, express my views and understanding of what this means to myself at least, and how we can understand why we have this day from my point of view at least. I'm not saying it's everyone's way of looking at it, but I've been studying our Muncie Delaware Nation history for quite some time and providing live Facebook sessions on it for some 45 hours now, and we've gone through the 1600s and 1700s and come to see the experiences of our nation and other nations from the time of contact and even before that up until the present day. And I'm just going to maybe talk a little bit about some background and how we've come to be where we are at right now on this day, June 21st, 2021. The First Nations have been around a long time here on Turtle Island, and right from the beginning, thousands and thousands of years ago. We once were and are becoming again very vibrant, healthy, independent, and self-governing peoples. We were once responsible for vast areas of land and resources provided to us by the Creator. In Muncie understanding, that's known as Kishalimokwang. And like all First Nations and on Turtle Island, similarly, we all had a duty to thank the Creator for this bounty of land and resources that were provided to us, and to treat each other with kindness and charity. It's a basic way of living that we all have shared across this island. And to live according to certain principles known in this area as the 7 grandfather teachings of love, honesty, respect, truth, courage, humility, and wisdom. Very basic and yet very important principles to guide us through our lives. We welcomed people into this country and helped them to survive and establish themselves in friendship and according to these principles. And many of these people that came here were very good people, and there always have been and still are very good people that we've developed with relationships with over this long period of time. However, there were others, those with all the power really, who had their eyes on making friends with us at first, but only with the goal of eventually betraying us and stealing our lands and resources. Disease, massacres, murder, alcohol, war, and other factors reduced our population significantly, while colonial populations flourished and left us somewhat vulnerable. Yet we continued to, I better check my sound here, I guess it's good. Okay, it looks good. Sorry. We continued to survive and maintain our ways of life, our culture, traditions, and ceremonies, even into the present times, despite incredible odds against us. We sided with the British through the 7 Years' War, what's also known as the French Indian War, the American Revolution. We sought their assistance during what's known as the Indian Wars, and allied again during the War of 1812, and even the Fenian raids of 1837 and 1838, where the Munsees and Chippewas sent some 50 men to guard the western gates of the city of London, just down the road from us. And thanks for the note that the sound is good. Someone's listening on this day. Thank you. But, we established and maintained an alliance that we thought would be upheld and honored after there was no more need for our involvement in wars between Britain and their various enemies, such as the French and then the Americans and then even the Fenians. In World War I and World War II, even the Boer Wars in the late 1800s, in Korea and Vietnam, and even we have had military men in military and women in military service up until the present day. We've continued this alliance and honorable relationship during all of this time. And it is no exaggeration, really, to say that if it were not for our alliances and our sacrifices made during these wars, and particularly the War of 1812, that there would not even be a country known as Canada today. Yet, when there was no more need for our use as allies, colonial governments in Canada began to take hold, and all of our past alliances, our honorable relationships, began to be forgotten or ignored. Our lands continued to be taken in dishonorable and fraudulent ways that Canada is just over the past few decades been trying to make right through the land claims process after courts have forced it to do so. As a way to continue to take our lands and resources and to diminish our power to maintain our ways of life, colonial governments began to make laws to do this. And I'd like to thank our member Judy McCallum for providing me with this information just today to help me go over some of these laws that Canada developed to do this. In 1857, a law was made, an act to encourage the gradual civilization of the Indians. And I've spoken at length in previous history sessions just how civilized we really were at the time of contact. Again, the bountiful resources, the beautiful lands and beautiful people that we were described as, and our ways of life, the fact that we were not war-like people during those times, had our own governments, our own systems of education, and all these other things that enabled us to have good, healthy, and long lives. A very beautiful civilization, really, although we didn't have the technical kind of civilization that the Europeans had developed, mainly to make war on each other. Ships and castles, cannons, guns, and weapons of all sorts. That's the sort of civilization that we didn't have, or the kind of capitalist civilization to make money for oneself and to not share it with others. So laws were made to somehow encourage us to become more civilized in this other sense. In 1859, another act towards civilization and enfranchisement was enacted. And enfranchisement was a way to pay Native people to join into or assimilate into the non-Indigenous culture. In post-Confederation times, our Prime Minister John A. Macdonald said that it was time to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indians. Again, to get rid of us as far as being independent and self-identifying people. And this was not much different than the legislation offered up by the Trudeau government in 1969, known as the White Paper, which I will talk a bit more about down the road here. In 1869, another law was passed to provide for the enfranchisement or assimilation of the Indian people. And in 1876, the Indian Act, as we know it today, was passed, which was an act that set out how the government was going to control us and tell us what we could do or not do in every aspect of our lives. And that act still exists today. In 1881, a law was passed to prohibit the sale of agricultural produce by Indians. You know, a form of economic genocide in a way to prevent us from competing with non-Indigenous people in farming and other activities of economic independence. Laws were made to prevent us from being able to sell the things we grew to outside sources. At the same time, local fairs in this area, because we were such good farmers and competed in local fairs and won prizes on a regular basis, created what was known as an Indian category, so we couldn't compete against non-natives anymore. We could only compete amongst ourselves, a kind of racism that was quite apparent in those days. In 1884, a law was passed to force the attendance of Indian youth in schools. And it's not like we did not want to have our people educated. I talked before how even in the 1700s, even in the 1600s, we sent people off to school, even universities. And in the Susquehanna areas, we asked for help with reading and writing and all these education skills that we thought would be useful to us. And here in Muncie, if one of the first schools in Upper Canada was built around 1820 and had 16 of our people in it during that period of time. And even the Mount Elgin School here, which later became a residential school, was first a joint venture by local First Nations and the government to provide industrial and other educational opportunities to our people to be able to operate both in our own traditional ways and in the non-Indigenous society that was forming around us. It later became turned into something much different. But it just shows that we made serious attempts to involve our young people and even our adults in education and to learn many of the ways of the non-Indigenous society. But in 1884, we were forced to attend these new types of schools, which became known as residential schools. In 1884, there was a law passed to prevent what's known as potlatches out on the west coast, to prevent people from taking part and having their own ceremonies that they've been practicing for many years, and even prohibiting dances within our communities. And in 1895, there was another law enacted to prevent certain ceremonies and other dances again, and especially where money or goods were given away. Laws to prevent us from sharing our wealth amongst each other and giving it away. Again, this sort of capitalistic civilization that they were trying to force upon us. In 1905, there was a law made to remove Indians from reserves near towns where there are 8,000 or more people. And then In 1911, another law to allow for even local towns, the province, railways, all these other uh, uh, bodies to actually expropriate our land and just take it for their own purposes. In 1920, again, this law was made mandatory to send children to residential schools, to ban the hereditary ways in which we appointed chiefs and counselors and other important people in our nations and communities, and to ensure that we did it through this elective process instead. And as well, again, forcing upon certain people what they call involuntary enfranchisement, not just if you want to, but forcing people to assimilate even further again. In 1927, a law was passed to prevent Native people from making legal claims, such as land claims and other civil types of claims against government bodies. And other laws were passed in between then, and finally in 1969, with the Pierre Trudeau government, came what's known as the White Paper, a law to finally simply get rid of the reserve system as we know it here in Canada, and to force everybody into the majority of society to move into towns and cities. Again, this was all laws really meant to find a way to take our land without having to purchase it or obtain it in any kind of fair way. By getting rid of reserves and Native people, all of a sudden all this land would become available to these rich criminals, basically, who wanted to get it and use it to make money. In 1970 or so, well, actually, in response to the White Paper, our own people, our leaders at that time, and other organizations of First Nations began to get together and oppose this White Paper of Pierre Trudeau's Liberal government. And things started to roll a bit, and we started to hire lawyers who were able to stand up for us in court, and hearings and legal decisions were made regarding our legal claims to land and other rights. And courts began to say, actually, we do have these valid claims and rights that the government has been trying to illegally take away from us during the past 100 or more years. In 1982, based on the efforts of our leadership before and during those times, even in this local area, we were able to get enacted into our Constitution a law recognizing and affirming our existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. Now, the word existing is the important catchphrase in that particular part of the Constitution. Canadian government officials required that word to be in there, thinking that all of our rights had been extinguished by this time, and they really didn't amount to much. However, through various court cases going into our Supreme Courts, it was determined that, in fact, there were many existing rights that we still had, and that we had been treated very much unfairly in many ways by the Canadian government up to that point. Around this time, what's known as devolution began to occur. The federal government started to allow us to take more control over finances that they were in control of previously, programs and services that we could provide to our people that were provided by them previously. And eventually what's known as inherent rights came onto the table, which became much more expansive than these existing rights in the Constitution. the rights to self-government, the recognition that we always had been self-governing people. We had our own forms of government, our own ways of education, our own kind of social welfare, and all those things that were part of our past ways of life, our culture, traditions, and some ceremonies. The only thing that the government seems to be quite hesitant on recognizing these days is our economic right, our right to be economically dependent. When it comes to money and sharing in the wealth of this country, it seems there's still a bit of a significant resistance to that. And along with these changes, this recognition of existing and then now lately inherent rights, more exposure has come to the fore regarding our past treatment by these laws that I had just mentioned, and especially regarding residential schools, survivors of what's known as the 60s scoop, and day school survivors. Apologies have been made to all of these groups, and compensation has been made to somehow rectify the harm made by their experience in these areas. Reconciliation has become the policy of government, which by definition means basically a mutually respectful relationship between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples, including government. So it seemed like, well, the apology's been made, the money's been provided, and now we're looking at reconciliation, a mutually respectful relationship. However, it's quite hard to accept some of these things by many people due to this long and harsh past treatment, and there's a continuing mistrust of government, even though there may be genuine efforts by government to truly apologize and reconcile these past differences. It appears that the Canadian public, at least, on a statistical research survey basis, if not the governments also want to be open to learn and understand these past injustices and truly find a way to support First Nations rather than to disregard us as has been done in the past through the education system and the Canadian government way of doing things itself. We've been neglected to in the history books and all the other aspects of the education system, but now things are changing in that regard also. So like I say, compensation, apologies, reconciliation, things are looking kind of good. People want to understand and learn more about these things. But then suddenly and recently, discoveries have been made of numbers, hundreds of bodies, remains of children that were found buried at various residential schools across this country. And it has caused us to take a second and even more serious look, perhaps, at the issues surrounding these schools and the impacts they have had on First Nations over many decades. It appears there were some 150,000 children who were forced to attend these schools, to be punished for trying to speak their own languages, prevented from learning their culture, traditions, and ceremonies, and resulting in broken communities, broken families, and broken individuals. And because of this, it resulted in what's known as the 60s scoop. Broken families, broken communities gave social workers the reasons to come in and say, well, you can't take care of your own children, so we're going to take them from you and place them in non-native families. And in addition to that, it's more of an assimilation, part of the assimilation policy also, which caused significant damage to our children, our people as well. Some 45,000 children were apprehended during the 60s scoop, I have learned from one of our own members who is one of those people. And even after the 1960s, these taking of our children from our homes has continued, and even until today, although local children's aid societies are trying to find ways to resolve these issues and work with us to find our own ways to deal with these problems and to prevent them from happening. And yet, the abusers, again, compensation and apologies and understanding and education and reconciliation is all very good. But when you think about it, the people who did this abuse and even murder in some cases, in many cases we don't even know why children died, they've gone unidentified to a certain extent and unpunished in any way over these years. And there's a cry for justice, in a sense, especially based on recent events, that, that's just enough is enough. Let's find a way to get some justice for these children whose remains have been found, and also those who even continue to live after the experiences they have had. Many of these individuals responsible were employed at these schools, then churches, governments, even police forces, and others directly involved or who turned a blind eye to everything that was happening. There was a vicious systemic racism that maybe not so bad today, although it still exists in some obvious and even subtle, very often in more subtle ways. It is just not clear the causes, like I say, of so many of these deaths. Why did so many children die? It's not quite clear. And these need to be investigated. Not just finding their remains, but investigation into the reasons for this. I just saw a post today from a friend, Darren Jacobs, at Alanapawi-Lakawit in Moraviantown, who provided a list of describing some of these murders by, I hate to say it, but church officials and employees of these schools, and which were reported to the police but never investigated, and sort of suggest not only criminal negligence, manslaughter, murder, but even a criminal conspiracy to cover much of this up. So, and this is as late as 1969. So, and even some of the families who made efforts to find out what happened to their children, it appears, were threatened by the police to prevent them from looking into these issues any further. So you wonder how justice can be achieved in this situation. Apologies and money, I don't think really does it in light of these recent discoveries especially. And I think, even though the government has provided of Ontario $10 million to investigate the grounds of these schools and to try and find the remains of more of these children, that's surely not enough either. I think it's really necessary to identify who these abusers, actually criminals to an extent, were. And even murderers, it appears, from eyewitness stories about these things that happened. If any of these people are still alive, they need to be held accountable, either in criminal court or maybe even through our own indigenous forms of justice, which probably aren't quite so harsh. They need to identify and apologize to each of these individual children and their families. And not just a general apology, but an individual and family apology might be a good start. The government needs to provide resources that we need to continue and to enhance our efforts to provide safe and culturally relevant help to the many people, families, and communities that are still affected significantly by all of this. There's a need for justice, for public awareness and education and healing regarding this past treatment if we are to continue on towards what might be called meaningful reconciliation. These recent discoveries open old wounds and maybe not so old wounds. They cause anger, sadness, frustration, and all kinds of emotions that are really not very easy to come to terms with. Yeah, we need to find a way to deal with them without letting them take over and making us have to live with them. On this day, it seems important to find a way to stand together in solidarity with each other in our communities and with our brother and sister communities, and even with all Canadian people who had flags lowered and expressed their sympathies across the country when these events were revealed a couple of weeks ago. I drove down from Parry Sound through the back roads and towns all the way to where I am here on the Deshkan-Zibi, and I can say, from what I saw, all flags were down everywhere from the citizens of this province and likely this country, having sympathy and showing their support in this way. So I just want to wish everyone hope and healing on this Solidarity Day of June 21st, 2021. And I'm just going to say Anishik, and I hope everyone is able to, again, stand together and look forward into the future and yet find a way to deal and heal with these injustices from the past. Again, Anishik, and have a good day.